Chapter 2, Visual Balance. In this chapter, we're going to talk about how artists deal with composing an overall image, encompassing the entire frame or structure of an art piece. Whereas in the previous chapter, we concentrated more on a specific area within the entire arrangement. So this is where our subject of visual balance comes in. When we're dealing with an entire picture, we want to make sure that it is designed in a way to be clear and hopefully create some sort of interest to our viewers. Here we have our usual frame where we view many of our 2D images, such as the artwork we've been doing up until now, photography, and of course movies. And if we add a simple shape, such as a circle in the middle, abstractly, it creates a very balanced visual. Now, as powerful as this image looks, such as a common design we see for country flags, this type of balance tends to also be static. That's why if you ever had an instructor critique you on why not to put things in the middle, they might comment that it looks uninteresting or boring. However, if we move that shape towards the right or left to create some sort of imbalance, it will also have the side effect and the illusion of visual movement. Now, simply moving a shape like this can also create a bit too much imbalance, and us viewers tend to want to seek some sort of order and balance again. So it's kind of like this back and forth visual mind game that we do as we interact with visuals. Let's take a look at some quick concepts. So as you see here, I've filled up the page with certain frames, just like the exercise we did early this term. Now putting in a shape, just like this gray circle, and if we were to put a line across on the bottom to make it seem like a scale or a type of seesaw, we can start to put a shape in here to make it feel a little bit more balanced. So I've put in a smaller circle with a darker value, but it still feels a little bit too imbalanced. So from here, I'm just going to move it way more to the left, where it starts to feel like it has more visual weight. Therefore, the overall image, based on the shape, size, and value, we can start to kind of get this sort of balance that's being communicated visually. Now, trying something a little bit different, let's use some rectangles with different values as well. So started with a larger rectangle with a sort of middle gray value. Gone ahead and put a darker gray to the left. And it feels like it needs one on the top. So I just went ahead and put a smaller, darker value to make a sort of triangle position the way we're viewing the shapes. And then from here, things start to feel a little bit more balanced as well. Now, if we were to use, different shapes instead of just circles or strictly rectangles, I've gone ahead and put a sort of a ground shape on this next one. From there, I can put in a rough triangle. This could represent anything, maybe a mountain, a building, a vehicle, or even a character. But once I have that shape down, it starts to feel like I need something on the bottom right corner. So similar to our other abstract designs with using shape, I feel like it needs a smaller object to the bottom, which I've gone ahead and made a little bit lighter. It still doesn't feel quite balanced, so I've gone ahead and also put a smaller triangle up in the middle right to sort of counter the other shapes. Now, instead of juggling these shapes back and forth, we can also think about radiating lines. similar to how we were pointing to our focal point. So here I've put in a circle with radiating lines going to the edges of the frame. And from here, it starts to feel like it has a bit of structure and overall support from the rest of the composition. Lastly, we can also use some organic lines, such as this S-curve that's waving around the entire frame. Starting from a top right corner and moving my way down. Even though as this feels a little bit more organic and loose, there's something about it in the way the shapes it's creating to make it feel a little bit visually pleasing or balanced. But let's take a quick break from all that abstract theory and actually try to see it in action through doing some quick master studies. And first up, we got Alphonse Mucha. So here I'm just doing a quick shape study. Now this isn't necessarily the same type of study I did in week 6 when we were trying to look for whether this was form, mass, or line. I'm just trying to find the overall shapes with quick tones, just so I can see how he's balancing these in terms of visual design. And what you'll notice from doing a quick study and just kind of seeing it from far away, you can see that the overall shape of the figure and her face is being framed by the shadow in the background, but it's also helping balance the overall shapes from top to bottom. Now, if we didn't have that shadow on the top, a lot of this would feel a little bit off balance, being that all the values are moved over to the right. So that simple top shadow does several things, which is create visual balance. It does a little bit of framing and also points to the subject's face. And as we move on to something a little bit more complex with way more shapes in the composition, here you'll find in Bernie Wrightson's piece how he's carefully composing all of these elements to get to the focal point. But the fun thing about this is a lot of the visual balance that's happening is in the small little areas. So up where there's the clouds, he's putting little pockets of dark in there to balance out the composition from left to right. He's also doing the same thing with the cast shadows of the figures. Since they're both to the left of the frame, he has a very long cast shadow that pretty much goes to the other side of the frame to kind of anchor them. And you'll notice that the dark sky is on the upper thirds. Since it's such a dark value, he has to balance it out with a larger light value encompassing 2/3 of the frame below. And as for those fissures, the cracks on the ground, whether or not he looked at reference, he definitely designed these shapes in order to keep balancing the overall image. So instead of thinking about which rock has to be accurate, what he's thinking about is his overall subjects, his focal point, and how this can work together as a composition. Next up, we have something slightly more complex in terms of shapes with Dean Cornwell's amazing painting here. And just like Mead Schaefer, he was also an American illustrator that pretty much comes from the same branch of school. And the really fun thing you'll find from Dean Cornwell's pieces is the way he uses a lot of these little shapes to kind of weave you in and out of his paintings. And every time I look at his paintings or do a quick study, I tend to find something a little bit new or a little bit different. And while I was doing this study, it was really fun to see how he's constantly pointing to the subjects in the illustration, and even the people to the very left, which are kind of just observing the conversation. He's definitely just thinking of them as just shapes to help balance out the overall composition. And even on the very bottom right corner, you'll see that little chain ring or whatever metal piece that is. He definitely put that in there to just balance out his composition once again. And one thing I found pretty funny in this painting is, since we've been talking a lot about arrows, is how there's a little arrow or triangle pointing at the man's face with that blue line, which I didn't see before. So Dean Cornwell, he's definitely a master of taking you throughout his whole painting with little shapes, lines, and little tonal values to keep you interested in looking around his whole painting. Next up, we got Kang Lee, who's been an influential concept artist for many years now. Now, besides the amazing worlds he was able to create, he was also a great designer when it came to composing all of these elements. So it's obvious that the focal point is where the people are, and where there's a large amount of contrast in the lava flow. But what you'll notice is to the left, he has these little rocks that help balance out that composition, since most of the visual weight is on the right side. And he's even put little hints of the lava to the very left, even though it's a little bit more faded and smaller. It definitely helps with balancing everything visually. So a nice simple concept, but still using a lot of the principles that the older masters have done before. For this next one, I won't be doing a quick study. However, let's just observe this and try to find those elements that we've talked about. So I picked this one in particular by Paul Felix, since it has a very symmetrical looking design where he put his main focal point in the very center. Now, I know in the beginning I mentioned about the dangers of putting your subject in the center, but what you can find here is how he's made some asymmetrical elements in his design, so it creates that visual balance, that's not too monotonous. And he's achieving this by certain elements such as the light clouds to the very right, and all the way to the opposite end on the bottom left corner, he has a darker value for that tower. And also in terms of how he's actually lighting the background with the overall city, you can see how he's using a diagonal line that cuts across. So instead of making it straight with the horizon line, he's made it into a diagonal to really design out how he wants you to move around his piece. So just like Edgar Payne's work and Dean Cornwell's, we can find how he's trying to take us through his entire piece through the use of hidden lines and arrows that take us across different sections of the entire artwork. Before we end this chapter, let's take a look back at the study we did for this Sicario screenshot. Now, as simple as this shot is, you can see those elements now that the set designers and the cinematographer has used in order to take us across the entire shot. Now over here to the very right, you can see that little dark area that we've even put in our study to show that, there's an element there, regardless of how small it is, helps balance out the composition. And all the way from her helmet that's on the ground, the people in the background that are talking, where the car is, we can see how they're all really just placeholders for the overall composition of this shot. So even though this is film and it's basically moving pictures, you can see how these cinematographers are thinking the same way that all of the illustrators and painters are thinking when it comes to designing out a picture. Just a quick recap of what we covered in this chapter and the general composition of an image. We saw how different picture makers are using shapes, sizes, and different values to help us viewers move through the entire image while feeling like the picture is complete through the use of visual balance. In the next chapter, we're going to talk about how these artists might be thinking in terms of what to actually use for those shapes, lines, values, color, and other elements that make up their composition.